d5, c4, c6, knight f3, knight f6, knight b d2, bishop f5, knight h4, bishop e4, Queen's Gambit, Slav defense, main line, Briar variation, opening line, f3, bishop g6, Queen's Gambit, Slav defense, main line, Briar variation, opening line. e3, out of opening book, knight takes g6, would have been in the Queen's Gambit, Slav defense, main line, Briar variation, opening line. e6, g3, bishop e7, enables the short castle. a3, knight b d7, c takes d5, c takes d5, knight takes g6, attacks black's rook at h8, blocks black's pawn at g7, and hampers the opponent's ability to castle to the kingside. H takes g6, removes the threat on black's rook at h8 and clears the way for a kingside castle. Black wins a knight and a pawn for a bishop and a pawn. Material is even. Bishop d3 makes way for a castle to the kingside. e5, castle kingside, castle kingside, queen b3 threatens black's pawn at b7, queen c8 removes the threat on black's pawn at b7, knight b1, e takes d4, e takes d4, white wins a pawn for a pawn. Material is even. Knight b8, knight c3, knight c6, threatens white's pawn at d4. Bishop e3, removes the threat on white's pawn at d4. Queen d7, rook a d1, rook f d8, rook f e1, knight e8, bishop f2, knight c7, takes the knight away from the edge of the board. Bishop f1, bishop f6, queen a2, g5, b4, g6, queen d2, king g7, b5, threatens black's knight at c6. Knight e7, moves it out of immediate jeopardy. Bishop e3, knight e6, bishop h3, pins black's knight at e6. Knight f5, frees black's knight at e6 from the pin. Bishop takes f5, pins black's knight at e6. G takes f5, frees the pin on black's knight. Black wins a bishop for a knight. Material is even. g4. Queen d3 attacks black's pawn at f5. Rook a c8. Rook c1. Rook c4. Knight e2. Knight c7 removes the threat on black's pawn at f5. Knight c3 removes the threat on white's pawn at b5. Rook c8. h3. G takes h3, creates a passed pawn on h3. King h2 threatens black's pawn at h3 and blocks black's pawn at h3. Knight takes b5, threatens white's pawn at a3 and isolates white's pawn at a3. Knight takes b5, protects white's pawn at a3 and threatens black's pawn at a7. Queen takes b5, removes the threat on black's pawn at a7. King takes h3. Black wins a knight and 2 pawns for a knight and a pawn. Black is up a pawn. Queen d7 releases the pin on black's rook at c4 and removes the threat on black's pawn at f5. King g2. b5. Rook b1. a6. Rook b c1. Queen e6. Bishop f2 leads to rook takes c1, rook takes e6, f takes e6, queen e2, rook 8 c6, queen h5, rook 6 c2, queen e8, rook e1, queen d7, check, king h6, queen f7, bishop takes d4, queen f8, check, king h7, queen f7, check, bishop g7, which wins a queen for 2 rooks and a pawn. Better is rook takes c4, leading to b takes c4, queen d1, queen e4, check, king f1, c3, bishop c1, queen h1, check, king f2, queen h2, check, king f3, rook c4, bishop e3, c2, queen d3, which wins a rook for a rook. Rook takes c1. Rook takes e6, forks black's pawn at a6 and black's pawn at f5. F takes e6, protects black's pawn at a6 and black's pawn at f5. g4. F takes g4, creates a passed pawn on g4 and isolates white's pawn at f4. Black wins 2 rooks and a pawn for a queen. Queen e2 forks black's pawn at e6 and black's pawn at g4. King f7 removes the threat on black's pawn at e6. Queen d3. Rook 1 c2 pins white's bishop. Queen h7 check, checks black's king and seizes the open file. King e8 moves it out of check. f5 threatens black's pawn at e6. Bishop takes d4, creates a passed pawn on d5. Black wins a pawn. Queen g6 check, leads to king d8, queen takes e6, rook takes f2, check, king g3, king c7, queen f7, check, king b6, queen takes d5, bishop c5, a4, b takes a4, king takes g4, rook c6, which wins 3 pawns for a bishop and a pawn. Better is queen g8, check, leading to king d7, queen takes e6, check, king c7, queen e7, check, king b8, queen d6, check, king a7, queen d7, check, rook 8 c7, queen takes c7, check, rook takes c7, bishop takes d4, check, king b7, f6, king c8, king g3, rook c4, which wins a rook, a bishop, and a pawn for a queen. This was White's key miscue in the game. White did regain the lost ground, but later resigned. King d8 moves it out of check. Queen takes e6, forks Black's pawn at a6 and Black's pawn at d5, creates a passed pawn on f5 and isolates Black's pawn at d5. Rook takes f2, check, removes the threat on Black's pawn at a6 and Black's pawn at d5, checks White's king and moves it behind the passed pawn at f5. Black wins a bishop for a pawn. King g3 moves it out of check, triple forks Black's pawn at a6, Black's pawn at d5, and Black's pawn at g4, and blocks Black's pawn at g4. Rook c3, check. Slightly better is rook c4. King takes g4. Forks Black's pawn at a6 and Black's pawn at d5. White wins a pawn. Rook g2, check, protects Black's pawn at a6 and Black's pawn at d5 and checks White's king. King f4. Moves it out of check and forks Black's pawn at a6 and Black's pawn at d5. Rook f2, check, look out, leads to king g4, which does not result in any captures. Much better is king c7, leading to queen e7, check, king b6, queen d6, check, rook c6, queen takes d5, rook f2, check, king g3, bishop c5, queen d8, check, king b7, queen d7, check, rook c7, queen d5, check, king a7, queen e5, which loses a pawn. Black's only meaningful error of the game gave away a 1 position, but White ended up resigning anyway. King g4 moves it out of check and forks Black's pawn at a6 and Black's pawn at d5. King c7. Queen e7, check, protects White's pawn at a3 and checks Black's king. King b6 moves it out of check. Queen d8, check, forks Black's pawn at d5 and Black's king. Rook c7 protects Black's king. Queen takes d5. Slightly better is queen d6, check. Bishop c5 moves it out of immediate jeopardy and attacks White's pawn at a3. Queen d8 pins Black's rook at c7. King b7 frees Black's rook at c7 from the pin. f6. advances the passed pawn. Bishop takes a3, creates passed pawns on a6 and b5. Black wins a pawn. Queen d5 check, checks black's king. King b6, moves it out of check and attacks white's pawn. Queen d8, pins black's rook at c7 and protects white's pawn. Bishop c5. Queen b8 check, checks black's king. Rook b7, removes the threat on black's king, forks white's queen and white's pawn, and moves it behind the passed pawn at b5. Queen d8 check, moves it to safety, protects white's pawn, and checks black's king. King a7, moves it out of check. Queen d5, attacks black's bishop. Bishop b6, moves it to safety. King g5, protects white's pawn. Rook c7. King g6. b4, advances the passed pawn. Queen e6, leads to bishop d4, king h5, rook takes f6, queen e4, rook d7, queen d3, rook f2, king g4, a5, queen b5, rook g7, check, king h3, which loses a pawn. Better is queen d3, leading to a5, queen d5, bishop c5, queen d8, king b7, queen d3, rook c6, queen b5, check, bishop b6, queen e5, rook c takes f6, check, queen takes f6, rook takes f6, check, king takes f6, a4, which wins 2 rooks for a queen and a pawn. Bishop d4. White resigns.